Picture this. It's 1847, and the American frontier is a place where a single mistake can mean death. Not the kind of sanitized danger we imagine today, but real, bone-deep, freezing to death in a cave kind of mortality. And in the frozen wasteland of Wyoming Territory, a man named Ezekiel Hawthorne is about to discover that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. Now, Hawthorne wasn't your typical mountain man. While other trappers focused obsessively on beaver pelts and quick profits, this guy had what his contemporaries called a fatal flaw: curiosity. He was always tinkering, always experimenting, always asking what if, when he should have been asking, where are the beaver? The mountain men at the Green River Rendezvous had finally had enough of his so-called fool experiments. Here's a man who would spend precious daylight hours testing different ways to preserve meat instead of setting traps. In a world where every hour counted and winter was always lurking around the corner, this was seen as more than eccentric, it was dangerous. So they cast him out. Think about what that meant in 1847 Wyoming. No GPS, no rescue helicopters, no cell phone to call for help. When those grizzled veterans of the wilderness told you to get lost, you were truly, catastrophically lost. And winter? Winter in Wyoming doesn't mess around. We're talking about temperatures that dropped to 30 degrees below zero. That's the kind of cold that kills you in stages, first your extremities, then your hope, then everything else. Hawthorne stumbled through that frozen wilderness for days, his supplies dwindling, his strength fading. His fool experiments seemed pretty foolish now, didn't they? But here's where our story takes a turn that would change not just one man's life, but the entire future of food preservation in America. Because sometimes, when you're at your absolute lowest point, when death is literally breathing down your neck, that's precisely when life hands you its greatest gifts. He found a cave. Or maybe the cave found him the way these stories work. It's hard to tell the difference. But this wasn't just any cave. This was a place where an elderly Shoshone woman named Singing Crow had made her winter preparations. Now pause for a moment and consider what this encounter represented. Here was a white man, half dead from cold and hunger, stumbling into the domain of a Native American woman who had every reason to let him freeze to death. The history between her people and his was already written in blood and broken treaties. But Singing Crow did something remarkable. She looked at this freezing stranger and saw not an enemy, but a fellow human being in desperate need. Maybe it was the way Hawthorne spoke to her, not with the arrogant demands that characterized most white Indian interactions, but with broken Shoshone words that carried genuine respect. Or maybe she simply recognized a soul worth saving. Whatever the reason, she took him in. For the next 3 moons, and when I say 3 moons, I mean 3 full months of winter isolation, Singing Crow became Hawthorne's teacher in ways that would revolutionize American food preservation. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about knowledge that had been refined over 7 generations of Shoshone wisdom, passed down from grandmother to granddaughter in an unbroken chain of accumulated expertise. She taught him the sacred preservation ways that most white men would never be trusted to learn. The specific wood combinations, juniper and sage, that created the perfect smoking environment. Not just any wood, mind you, but precise combinations that had been tested and refined over centuries. She showed him the lunar calendar for gathering salt from the ancient deposits near what we now call Devil's Tower, because the moon phases affected not just the tides in distant oceans, but the very chemistry of preservation itself. And then came the 7 sacred herbs. This was the heart of it all, the secret that could preserve meat for what the Shoshone called the time it takes a child to become a warrior, roughly 15 to 20 years by their reckoning. But these weren't just random plants picked from the wilderness. Each herb had its purpose, its specific role in the chemistry of preservation, combined with prayer and patience, and notice that patience part, because patience was exactly what had gotten Hawthorne cast out. In the first place, these herbs could work what seemed like magic. But here's what made Hawthorne special. He didn't just learn Singing Crow's methods, he understood them. His European background gave him knowledge of salt-curing techniques that had been developed over centuries in completely different climates and conditions. Instead of dismissing either tradition, He began to see how they could work together. He added innovations like precise temperature control using heated river stones, creating microclimates within the smoking process that could be adjusted for different types of meat and different weather conditions. Then came his revolutionary insight: thin slicing meat against the grain. This seems obvious now, but think about it from the perspective of 1847. Traditional preservation methods used thick cuts because people assumed that thinner pieces would fall apart or lose their nutritional value. Hawthorne realized that by cutting against the grain in precise thin slices, he could dramatically speed up the drying process while actually improving the final product. Faster drying meant less time for harmful bacteria to establish themselves. More complete drying meant longer preservation. When spring finally arrived and the snows began to melt, Hawthorne made his way back to Fort Laramie. But he wasn't the same desperate man who had been cast out months earlier. He carried with him perfectly preserved elk, buffalo, and this was the real stunner delicate trout that should have been impossible to preserve using any known method. Picture the scene when he walked into that trading post. The same men who had mocked his fool experiments were dealing with their own disasters. Winter had been hard on everyone, but it had been catastrophic for stored meat. The 40% spoilage rate wasn't just a statistic, it was families going hungry, trading posts going bankrupt, and frontier settlements failing because they couldn't maintain reliable food supplies through the harsh months. But Hawthorne's meat? Perfect. Fresh as the day it was prepared, not just edible, but actually good. The texture was right, the flavor was concentrated and rich, and there wasn't a hint of the rot that had destroyed everyone else's winter stores. Suddenly, those fool experiments didn't seem so foolish anymore. The established traders, the ones who had profited from the seasonal supply shortages and the desperate prices that starvation could command, saw something that terrified them more than any Cheyenne war party: a solution. Because when you can solve the problem of food preservation on the frontier, you're not just saving lives, you're destroying an entire economic system built on scarcity and desperation. And that, my friends, is when things were about to get very interesting indeed. The summer of 1848 brought the annual rendezvous to Fort Bridger, and if you've never experienced one of these frontier gatherings, imagine the wildest combination of county fair, business convention, and barely controlled chaos you can think of, then multiply it by 10. Trappers, traders, Native Americans, settlers, and every variety of frontier character descended on Jim Bridger's trading post for weeks of commerce, competition, and more than a little controlled mayhem. But this year's rendezvous was different. Word of Hawthorne's miraculous preserved meat had spread across mountains faster than wildfire, and everyone wanted to see the man who claimed he could solve the preservation problem that had plagued the frontier since the first white man set foot west of the Missouri River. Some came as believers, others as skeptics, but one man came with very different intentions entirely. Jacques Iron Jaw Baptiste wasn't just another trader, he was the trader. This man controlled the meat supply for 3 entire territories, and he had gotten rich off the very problem that Hawthorne claimed to have solved. Baptiste's empire was built on scarcity, on the predictable failure of traditional preservation methods, on the desperation that drove prices through the roof when winter stores went bad. The 40% spoilage rate that bankrupted families and killed settlers wasn't a problem to Baptiste, it was his business model. Iron Jaw had earned his nickname the hard way, taking a Crow war club to the face during a trading dispute and living to tell about it. His jaw had been wired back together with actual iron wire by a cavalry surgeon, giving him a permanent grimace that made even seasoned mountain men nervous. When Baptiste spoke, which wasn't often, people listened. When he made a challenge, smart men accepted it only if they were very sure of their ground or very tired of living. At the height of the rendezvous, with hundreds of witnesses gathered around the central fire, Baptiste stood up and pointed one gnarled finger directly at Hawthorne. The crowd went silent. You could hear the pine logs crackling, the distant sound of horses, the collective held breath of people who knew they were about to witness something that would become frontier legend. Ezekiel Hawthorne, Baptiste's voice carried that particular authority that comes from years of life and death decision-making. You claim your devil's leather can last longer than any man's meat has a right to last, but I've been feeding this frontier for 20 years, and I know what's possible and what's just talk around a campfire. The challenge he laid down was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. Hawthorne would prepare his preserved meat using whatever methods he claimed were so revolutionary. But instead of the few months that represented the outer limit of traditional preservation, this meat would have to last 4 full seasons. Not 4 months, 4 complete seasonal cycles. 12 full months of every weather condition the frontier could throw at it. Think about what that meant in terms of environmental stress. Summer heat that reached 110 degrees in the shade, the kind of heat that turned wagon wheels soft and made metal too hot to touch. Winter cold that dropped to -40 degrees, cold so severe it could freeze a man's breath solid before it left his lungs. Spring floods that turned the high plains into swampland and made the humidity thick enough to cut with a knife. And autumn temperature swings so dramatic they could crack seasoned timber and split rocks. But Baptiste wasn't finished. The stakes had to match the impossibility of the challenge. If Hawthorne's meat failed when it failed, because Baptiste was certain it would, he would face permanent banishment from every trading post west of the Missouri River. In a world where these outposts represented the difference between life and death, this was essentially a death sentence. No supplies, no shelter, no way to survive the frontier's endless challenges. And if somehow, impossibly, the meat lasted, Baptiste would acknowledge Hawthorne as the master of preservation and step aside from the territory meat trade entirely. For a man whose identity and fortune were built on controlling food supplies, this was like betting his very existence. Hawthorne looked around at the sea of faces, some hostile, some curious, many just hungry for entertainment. He could have walked away. Any sane man would have walked away. But here's the thing about Ezekiel, Hawthorne. He'd already walked through death once that winter with Singing Crow, and he'd learned something about the difference between real confidence and frontier bluster. "I accept," he said simply, and the crowd erupted. What followed was the most intense week of food preparation the frontier had ever witnessed. Hawthorne didn't just work, he taught. Every step of his process became a public demonstration, as doubters came to mock but stayed to learn. This wasn't just about winning a bet anymore. This was about proving that knowledge could triumph over tradition, that innovation could overcome the brutal limitations that had claimed so many frontier lives. He showed them how different meats required completely different approaches. Buffalo, with its dense grain and high fat content, needed longer smoking times but could achieve better long-term preservation. Elk, leaner and more delicate, required precise temperature control to avoid over-drying. Bear meat, rich with protective fat, could be used to actually seal other preserved meats against moisture if handled correctly. The cutting technique became an art form in itself, 1/4 inch thick, not a suggestion, but a precise measurement that Hawthorne demonstrated again and again. Thinner than that, and the meat became powder that would blow away in the first strong wind. Thicker, and the center would harbor the rot that destroyed everything. He used a specially made knife, kept sharp enough to shave with, and cut against the grain with movements so practiced they looked like a ritual dance. Mary Sullivan, Fort Bridger's head cook, became his first and most important convert. Mary was nobody's fool. She'd buried one husband to frontier starvation and wasn't about to lose another to spoiled meat. She'd seen enough preservation failures to fill a graveyard, and she knew desperation when she saw it. But when she watched Hawthorne work, when she saw the precision and the science behind what others dismissed as luck, she understood that this was something entirely different. "This isn't just about lasting longer," she told the gathered crowd, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd fed frontier families through dozens of brutal winters. "This is about never having to choose between eating spoiled meat or watching your children starve. This changes everything." Hawthorne's secret blend became the subject of intense speculation. Everyone could see the 7 herbs that Singing Crow had taught him, but there were other elements that seemed to come from some deeper understanding of preservation chemistry. Wild honey, not just for flavor, but for its natural preservative properties, crushed juniper berries that added both taste and antimicrobial protection, and most mysteriously, volcanic ash from the Yellowstone region that created an alkaline barrier against decay. Where had he learned about volcanic ash? That knowledge came from a combination of sources, partly from Singing Crow's ancient wisdom about which earths had preserving power, partly from his own experimentation with different mineral additions, and partly from pure frontier ingenuity. The ash created a pH environment that hostile bacteria simply couldn't survive in, essentially turning each piece of meat into its own preservation system. Under the skeptical eyes of Fort Bridger's entire population, traders, trappers, settlers, soldiers, and Native Americans who'd come for the rendezvous Hawthorne prepared 4 separate caches. Each cache contained 50 pounds of various preserved meats, representing enough nutrition to keep a family alive through a hard winter. But these weren't just stored in any old containers. Hawthorne had learned from Singing Crow about sealing techniques that used pine resin, animal hides, and precise layering to create an environment that would remain stable regardless of external conditions. The caches were marked with dates that seemed to mock the very concept of food preservation. Summer 1849, winter 1849, spring 1850, and the final test that made even Hawthorne's supporters nervous, summer 1852. 4 full years from the day of sealing. 4 years of heat, cold, moisture, drought, and every environmental challenge the frontier could devise. As the crowd dispersed and the rendezvous wound down, everyone understood that they'd witnessed something unprecedented. Whether it was the beginning of a preservation revolution or an elaborate setup for spectacular failure remained to be seen. But one thing was certain. The frontier would never look at food the same way again. The waiting had begun. By 1849, when that first cache was cracked open after a full year of frontier weather, word of Hawthorne's challenge had spread from the Columbia River to the Rio Grande. And here's the beautiful timing of history for you. This knowledge explosion coincided perfectly with the California gold rush, creating a desperate, immediate demand for provisions that could survive the brutal journey west. Picture the scene at Fort Bridger when Baptiste himself, surrounded by witnesses who'd travelled hundreds of miles just for this moment, broke the seal on that first cache. A year of summer heat that had warped wagon wheels, winter cold that had frozen solid every other preserved food source, spring floods that had rotted supplies stored just months earlier, and the beginning of another scorching summer. Traditional preserved meat stored under the same conditions had become a health hazard within 4 months. But Hawthorne's meat? Perfect. Not just edible perfect. The texture was exactly right. The flavour had actually improved with age, developing a rich, concentrated taste that made fresh meat seem bland by comparison. When Baptiste bit into that first piece, you could see something die in his eyes. This wasn't just about losing a bet. This was about watching an entire economic system built on scarcity and predictable failure collapse in a single moment. The crowd's reaction was immediate and explosive. These weren't easily impressed people. Frontier life had beaten the gullibility out of anyone who'd survived this long. But here was proof that the fundamental problem of frontier existence had been solved. No more choosing between starvation and spoiled meat. No more watching children die because winter stores had failed. No more trading posts going bankrupt because 40% of their inventory had become worthless. Overnight, Ezekiel Hawthorne became the most sought-after man on the frontier. Not just famous, desperately needed. Every wagon train preparing for California, every trading post facing another brutal winter, every frontier family looking to establish a homestead in previously uninhabitable territory needed what he could provide. But here's where Hawthorne proved he was more than just a lucky experimenter. He was a visionary businessman. Instead of trying to personally handle every request, which would have been impossible and probably fatal, he developed what we'd recognize today as a brilliant franchise system. He would teach his complete method, holding nothing back, to one carefully selected family per territory. In exchange, he'd receive 10% of their preserved meat sales, and they'd become Hawthorne-certified producers, maintaining quality standards while spreading the technique faster than any single man could travel. This wasn't just about business expansion. This was about ensuring the knowledge survived even if he didn't. Hawthorne had learned from Singing Crow that truly valuable wisdom needed to be shared, not hoarded. Every family he taught became a repository of preservation knowledge that could weather disasters, conflicts, and the 1,000 random catastrophes that claimed frontier lives. The Oregon Trail became his proving ground, and the results were staggering. Wagon trains using Hawthorne Jerky reported 0 deaths from starvation compared to the previous 30% mortality rate. Think about that number for a moment. 30%. Nearly 1 in 3 people who attempted the journey west died from hunger-related causes. Hawthorne's preserved meat didn't just improve those odds, it eliminated starvation deaths entirely. Captain William Sherman, yes, the same Sherman who would later march to the sea, wrote a letter that became frontier legend. Hawthorne's preserved beef allowed my cavalry unit to pursue hostile Comanche raiders for 6 weeks through the desert without resupply, something previously impossible. We traveled light, moved fast, and never once worried about our food situation. This changes military strategy on the frontier completely. 6 weeks in the desert without resupply. To understand what that meant, you have to know that traditional cavalry operations were limited to 3 or 4 days from their supply lines. Any longer, and the horses would be carrying so much food and water that they couldn't function as cavalry. Hawthorne's preservation methods didn't just extend range, they revolutionized it. The economic impact was staggering in ways that rippled through every aspect of frontier commerce. Trading posts saw profits increase 300% because they could now stockpile inventory year-round instead of watching it rot. New settlements sprouted in previously uninhabitable regions because reliable food storage made permanent habitation possible. The price of preserved meat dropped by 60% even as demand soared, because the elimination of spoilage meant that supply could finally meet demand. But success on the frontier always came with a price, and Hawthorne's innovations threatened some very powerful interests back east. The established meatpacking monopolies had built their fortunes on controlling supplies and maintaining artificial scarcity. When word reached them that some frontier experimenter had solved the preservation problem, they saw it as a direct attack on their entire business model. They sent hired guns. Not to compete to eliminate, this wasn't business competition. This was industrial warfare brought to the frontier with bullets and intimidation. The plan was simple. Kill Hawthorne, steal his secrets, and then control the new preservation methods through their existing monopoly structure. But the Eastern monopolists had made a fundamental miscalculation. They thought they were dealing with one man and his secret knowledge. What they discovered at Devil's Canyon was that Hawthorne had created something much more dangerous to their interests: a community. The shootout at Devil's Canyon became the stuff of frontier legend, but the real story wasn't about gunfighting. It was about loyalty earned through genuine service. When those 30 hired killers rode into the canyon expecting to find one man with a secret, they found 17 frontier families that Hawthorne had taught standing with him, armed and ready to defend not just a person, but a way of life that had transformed their existence. Mary Sullivan was there with her husband's old cavalry rifle. The Hendersons from the North Platte Territory brought their 3 grown sons, all crack shots. The Yamamoto family, yes. There were Japanese settlers on the frontier. Another story, history often forgets, had traveled 200 miles when they heard about the threat. These weren't professional gunfighters. They were people whose lives had been fundamentally changed by reliable food preservation, and they weren't about to let it be taken away. The battle itself was over quickly. 30 hired guns, no matter how professional, couldn't overcome 17 frontier families fighting on familiar ground to protect something that had saved their children's lives. But the real victory wasn't military, it was philosophical. The monopolists learned that you can't kill an idea whose time has come, especially when that idea has been shared freely rather than hoarded selfishly. More importantly, the frontier learned that knowledge shared created power that couldn't be destroyed by violence or economic manipulation. Every family Hawthorne had taught represented not just a business partnership, but a fortress of preservation wisdom that could survive any attempt at suppression. The hired guns who survived Devil's Canyon carried a message back east. The preservation revolution couldn't be stopped because it wasn't controlled by one man or one location. It was embedded in the frontier itself, taught family by family, spread through networks of trust and mutual benefit that no amount of money or violence could penetrate. And this was just the beginning. The second cache wouldn't be opened until winter 1849, but already the implications were clear. The frontier had found its solution to the preservation problem, and that solution was spreading faster than wildfire across a landscape that desperately needed exactly this kind of innovation. The question now wasn't whether Hawthorne's methods worked that had been proven beyond doubt. The question was how completely they would transform not just the frontier, but the entire American relationship with food, distance, and the possibilities of westward expansion. The opening of the final cache in 1852 should have been Ezekiel Hawthorne's greatest triumph. 4 full years longer than anyone had believed possible, longer than traditional preservation methods could even dream of achieving. When Jacques Ironjaw Baptiste, now a grudging ally rather than an enemy, broke the seal on that last container, the meat inside wasn't just preserved, it was perfect. 4 years of every weather condition the frontier could devise, and the jerky looked and tasted as good as the day it was sealed. But Hawthorne wasn't there to see his vindication. Tuberculosis, that great killer of the 19th century, had been eating away at his lungs since 1851. The years of hardship, exposure, and constant travel had weakened a constitution that was never particularly strong to begin with. By the time of the final cache opening, he was bedridden in a cabin near Fort Laramie, coughing up blood and watching his life's work continue without him. Here's what made Hawthorne truly extraordinary. He'd seen this coming and planned for it. From 1852 to his death in October 1856, he devoted every remaining ounce of energy to ensuring his knowledge would survive and evolve. The Hawthorne Preservation Manual became his obsession, a complete documentation of every technique, every innovation, every hard-learned lesson from his years of experimentation. But this wasn't just a technical manual. Hawthorne understood that preservation knowledge without cultural context would eventually be forgotten or corrupted. So he documented everything. The history he'd learned from Singing Crow, about 7 generations of Shoshone wisdom, the European salt-curing techniques his grandfather had brought from the old country, the innovations he'd developed through frontier necessity, and most importantly, the philosophy behind it all. He had 2 inheritors of this knowledge, and he chose them carefully. His daughter Elizabeth received the technical knowledge, the precise measurements, the chemical understanding, the scientific principles that made preservation work reliably. She had inherited her father's analytical mind and his patience for experimentation. But knowledge needs more than science to survive. It needs spirit. That's where White Eagle came in. Hawthorne had formally adopted this young Shoshone man who'd come looking for the white man who'd learned from Singing Crow. White Eagle carried the cultural wisdom, the understanding of preservation as something sacred rather than merely practical. He knew the prayers, the ceremonies, the deep respect for the animals whose lives became sustenance for others. On his deathbed in October 1856, with snow beginning to fall outside his cabin window, Hawthorne made his final revelation to Elizabeth. There was one more secret, something even the detailed manual couldn't fully capture. The prayer that Singing Crow had taught him the exact words that had to be spoken during the full moon salting, honoring the spirit of the animal and acknowledging the ancient compact between hunter and prey. This wasn't superstition, though it might sound like it to modern ears. This was the culmination of everything Hawthorne had learned about preservation. The technical knowledge could produce good jerky, but the spiritual knowledge, the understanding that preservation was about more than just extending shelf life. That's what created food that could last 4 years and still taste perfect. Elizabeth wrote down every word of that final prayer, but she also understood something her father had been trying to teach her all along. The real secret wasn't in any specific technique or formula. The real secret was the willingness to learn from anyone who had knowledge to share, regardless of their background or the apparent strangeness of their methods. Hawthorne's techniques evolved, but never fundamentally changed. During the Civil War, Union soldiers carried Hawthorne jerky on marches that would have been impossible with traditional supplies. When construction began on the Transcontinental Railroad, work crews survived in impossible conditions because they had reliable preserved food that wouldn't spoil in desert heat or mountain cold. But the real measure of Hawthorne's impact wasn't military or industrial, it was personal. Families stopped losing children to starvation. Frontier settlements became permanent communities instead of seasonal camps. The terrible choice between eating spoiled meat or watching loved ones die simply disappeared from American frontier life. By the 1870s, Hawthorne's certified had become more than a mark of quality. It was a guarantee of survival. The preservation network he'd established had grown into hundreds of family operations across the West, each maintaining the standards he'd established while adapting to local conditions and available ingredients. The economic transformation was complete by 1880. The preserved foods industry, worth billions in today's money, traced its foundation directly to techniques developed in a frozen Wyoming cave by a desperate mountain man and a generous Shoshone woman. The seasonal food shortages that had defined frontier life for generations became historical curiosities rather than annual disasters. But here's where the story gets really interesting from our modern perspective. In 1952, exactly 100 years after Hawthorne's 4-year cache proved the impossible possible, archaeologists exploring Wyoming caves made an extraordinary discovery. Hidden in a natural refrigeration chamber, protected by the same sealing techniques Hawthorne had perfected, they found one of his original emergency caches. The Jerky was still there, 100 years old, preserved by techniques that Hawthorne had learned from 7 generations of Shoshone wisdom and refined through frontier necessity. When tested by brave researchers, and yes, someone actually tasted century-old jerky in the name of science, it still contained safe levels of protein and, according to the researchers' notes, tasted like history itself. That discovery sparked a renaissance in traditional preservation methods. Modern artisan producers began returning to Hawthorne's original techniques, finding them superior to industrial processing in both flavor and nutritional content. The military's Meals Ready-to-Eat programs studied his methods and discovered principles that improved their own development of long-term field rations. Today, if you visit Wyoming, you can still see the original smoking houses that Elizabeth Hawthorne built to preserve her father's legacy. The Hawthorne Foundation, still run by descendants who carry both his bloodline and White Eagle's teachings, maintains these structures as working museums. They teach traditional preservation to anyone who comes with respect for the old ways, just as Singing Crow once taught a desperate mountain man the secrets that would feed a nation. But the most remarkable part of Hawthorne's legacy isn't technological, it's philosophical. In an age when knowledge was often hoarded for competitive advantage, he chose to share freely. In a time when cultural differences were used to justify violence and exploitation, he proved that wisdom could cross any boundary if people approached each other with genuine respect. The preservation techniques that saved Hawthorne's life in that Wyoming cave didn't just solve a practical problem. They demonstrated that the most powerful innovations come from combining different traditions, different ways of knowing, different approaches to ancient challenges. Singing Crow's 7 generations of accumulated wisdom merged with European salt-curing techniques and frontier ingenuity to create something entirely new yet deeply rooted in the best of multiple traditions. And maybe that's the real lesson of Ezekiel Hawthorne's story. In a world that often seems divided by differences cultural, technological, philosophical, his legacy reminds us that our greatest advances come not from isolation, but from the courage to learn from anyone who has knowledge worth sharing. From a frozen cave in Wyoming to feeding armies and building railroads, from individual survival to industrial transformation, the story of American food preservation began with one simple act, a desperate man asking for help, and a generous woman willing to teach. That's how you change the world. Not with grand gestures or dramatic proclamations, but with patience, respect, and the willingness to share what you've learned with anyone ready to listen. Just like Singing Crow taught Hawthorne, just like Hawthorne taught the frontier, just like the Hawthorne Foundation continues to teach today, one student at a time, preserving not just food but the knowledge and wisdom that make survival possible. Sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin in the quietest places, with the simplest acts of human kindness. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, those revolutions echo across centuries, feeding generations we'll never meet with wisdom we're only now beginning to understand.